Okay, so this is going to be my presentation on mummies, museums, and more. So, introduction about my presentation. We will dive into learning more about why Egyptian mummies became popular, how they became popular in museums, and what's the future going to be for these mummies in Egypt. So, what is a mummy? A mummy is basically someone who died in ancient Egypt and they wanted to preserve the body by doing a process on the body and wrapping them up in cloth. And then they would put them in a buried site. And depending on if they were a pharaoh, they would have their treasures with them and also some other artifacts. Um, the discovery. So this is more a discovery to the birth of Egyptology, which is a term for when mummies became popular. There's not really a site or article I could find who discovered the first mummy. The only thing I found out was about Petro del Vara, who wrote a book and talked about how he picked up a pair of mummies in 1615 and brought them back to Rome. He described the pair of mummies being beautiful in his letters. And then after Napoleon's invasion, um, this really sparked the interest in Egyptology, which is the term given about studying Egypt and the ancient ways of how they did their mummies. Of course, as the years passed, lots of people were interested in more in what uh, mummies were. And this discovery of the Pharaoh the Tut, as his shortened name, really captured more of public's interest and trying to learn more about where mummies came from. But before museums and before the culture came into place, mummies were actually used for medicine. They would grind up the mummies and um, use them for broken bones or cures and antidotes for poisons. The reason being is that they had like a black rock asphalt to the mummy, and that's something that they wanted to use for medical reasons. Of course, there were all kinds of skeptics about this, but the scientists and pharmacists decided that grinding up mummies was a good medicine. Then it shifted in the Victorian age, where the British was very skeptical after trying to see if mummies were actually good for medicine, and they decided that they wanted to put them in museums. So archaeologists discovered more and more mummies, and this time they didn't grind them up, and they would put them on display for people to see. But they first started off in private houses for the wealthy. They would bring the items to people's houses and do viewings, but then they opened up museums for everyone. And then I found this document where this one guy was talking about how the museum shouldn't be open on certain days because the wealthy has all the time on weekdays to see, because this was more of a wealthy, like, a leisure time. But I think it's interesting with that because it did talk about how the museums had mummies as an exhibit, and also because there's not a lot of documents out there that would oppose for a museum to be open on certain days. And then uh, Thomas Cook was an important part of this process because he was a travel agency. He would bring people to other places like Egypt, Paris, and all over across the countries. And specifically to this a museum in England who was one of the first museums to open up an exhibit for mummies in Egypt, which could have been the start of wanting to see more mummies in museums. So this is about the first myth that happened about mummies because in movies and horror novels, you recall the mummy's curse or the curse of the mummy, which is a legend, of course, and it was for to stop people from stealing the mummies because they were should be left alone. Um, they shouldn't be dug up. They since they were dead already. But this is the start of more of pulp culture. Was this mummy's curse? And then, of course, more pop culture came into place, like more movies about mummies, like The Mummies with Brendan Fraser in it. This movie was very exaggerated for the mummies coming to life and having books that can summon mummies back to life. But of course, this is all fictional. Mummies don't come back to life, and there's no magical saying for them to. And it also exaggerated how archaeologists were portrayed. In different movies, like Indiana Jones, you see that they were um, scholarly, so they would be hired by schools or museums, but in reality, archaeologists are um, contracted, so they have private investors instead of museums and schools. So the mummification process is interesting. Um, with all the technology, they were able to come up with what kind of tools were used. They had they had knives, they had these other tools that would help out bring out the brain, but usually they would cut up and have inserts to get the organs out, put them in separate jars, and then wrap up the body. And then they would place them into tombs and like a little coffin, like that was like a had symbols on it, and then be in a pyramid and like in a few slides before, depending on who they were, they had the best place to rest. Other artifacts were found in these sightings, like jars and gold, and this one thing called Shabbatis, which were little figures that would help them not get stolen and grant them make sure they have a healthy like afterlife. So some of the dig sites today, they are because of technology getting better and being more advanced, they are able to use 3D um, structures. And there's this article about the Great Pyramid of Giza. There's a lot of scientific processes. I couldn't understand most of it, but usually they're using like these 3D models and image modeling to get a better image of what the pyramids were like. And also, scientists are trying to extract DNA from mummies to see how they lived. Um, it's also very popular today, Egyptian mummies. There's more mummy movies that are coming out 2023, 2025. Um, archaeologists are learning more about mummies. They want to see what if they're missing anything with the mummification process. In the future of mummies, like I said, they are extracting DNA samples. They have 3D imaging. They have a lot of X-rays that they can use to actually see the bone um, density and bone structure of the mummies. So, in summary, mummies are still popular. They have been popular over the years, and I'm excited to see the future. And then these are all my citations.